G'day there folks, it's Graeme Anderson here. This is a recording of a slide presentation presented to the Dairy Service Provider gathering had on June 20 at Agriculture Victoria office down there at Warnnambool. So greetings to all. So Agriculture Victoria provides seasonal risk products like the Break newsletter or soil moisture probe information right across the state and for all industries. We attend about 100 forums a year, and there's also the Milking the Weather, which is a specific dairy version, which is really helping farmers better understand seasonal forecasts. So getting into it, here's rainfall for last year. You can see these sort of colours here is decile 10, which is where rainfall was in the equivalent to the wettest 10% of years. So we can see it was pretty wet, not just in Western Victoria and the southwest, but over a lot of Australia. And you can see that's really pretty typical pattern for what was happening up here. The Indian Ocean dipole last year was really set to its wet phase. So we'll talk a little bit about that and its role in forecasting. Now this year, the last 3 months from March to May, interesting, there was the cyclone down the east coast, but we got some good moisture drifted in and have had a pretty good autumn, and especially the western part of the state and down southwest off to a great start. Pretty fortunate to get that sort of good wet April because it was not shared in parts of South Australia and Western Australia where there have been a lack of cold fronts so far. And speaking of a lack of cold fronts, really for June so far, we've had plenty of clear skies and pretty good because we've had plenty of soil moisture, but it's probably looking at being a drier than average June. So here's how we're tracking. This is there's a good little website actually called Climate. You can download it onto your iPhone or iPad or go to the website australianclimate.net.au. You can download your nearest weather station and get the long-term rainfall records and do all sorts of queries. But this is just showing, say for Koroit, down your part of the world, how progress rainfall compared to the long-term averages, and this shows all of the ranges, but we're clearly above average for this time of the year compared to the long-term average. Here's a long-term record now from Cobden. This is going back to 1894. So this reading here would be from 1894 all the way through to last year. This is an anomaly graph, so it actually shows the long-term average is 839 millimetres, but some years you can see it was 1200 millimetres of rainfall. Other years it can be barely 600 mils. So a lot of variation in that long-term record. And what you'll notice that average actually doesn't happen that often. If you look at the sort of years where we get pretty close to average, doesn't happen a lot. And when we look at the last 20 years in particular, we've had 14 drier and only 6 wetter. So a little bit drier, and that's probably pretty typical of a lot of parts of across Victoria. So we'll talk a bit about that. But one of the questions people ask is there any, from a seasonal forecasting point of view, any way of telling which years will be above the line or below the line? And that's where we'll get into understanding seasonal forecasting. Here's that Cobden record looking at the seasons right back to 1894. So that's summer rainfall, that's autumn, that's winter and spring. You can see plenty of variability in there. Some odd runs of drier years, but probably the main thing I'll point out is that autumns, we've probably had a more than our fair share of drier autumns, so that's why it's been good to get a good one this year. And you can sort of see there, I guess, especially with springs. Last spring was a ripper, but the two previous springs before that were equally as dry as anything we've had in the long-term history. So they were pretty tough. So these are the key 4 drivers that really are right behind our wetter and dry years down in southwest Victoria. Now, to make rainfall down in this part of the world, we've got to have a good supply of moisture, and some years we get plenty of tropical moisture coming in from the Pacific Ocean, and some years it's in shorter supply. And it's the same too for the Indian Ocean dipole. It can be really helpful like it was last year, sending in lots of moisture, but some years it's also in a drier mood. And one of the reasons we have really reliable rainfall down here is that this is sort of where the moisture might feed in, and it might be variable from year to year, but we've got this reliable flow of cold air, and when moisture hits cold air, that brings out reliable rainfall. So you can see that these cold fronts, which all queue up around the Southern Ocean, they're a really important trigger that brings reliable rainfall. So wetter years are when either one or both of these oceans are sending lots of moisture, and then dry years are when either one or both of them happen to be not sending much moisture. We might still be getting the odd front, but just not much moisture to feed into it. Now, this is what seasonal forecasting spends a lot of time looking at sea surface temperature maps. And now, the oceans here along the equator are obviously really warm, and the oceans down here are cold. But this is a sea surface temperature anomaly map, which is showing areas of ocean that might be 1 to 2 degrees warmer than its long-term average, and areas of ocean that might be 1 to 2 degrees cooler. So you can see here, this is back in September 2006 when we had a particularly dry spring. You can see an El Nino out here in the Pacific, lots of extra warm water out there, and above that warmest water would be where all of the cloud and moisture is, so there would be floods and things happening off the coast of South America. You'll notice up here though, in this area north of Australia, that the oceans are a bit cooler, so this would have meant a lack of cloud and a lack of moisture to feed into our weather patterns down here. You note that the Indian Ocean dipole also, the cooler water was here, warmer water over there, so both of those oceans in that year were in not in a helpful mood for moisture. So that's what a dry pattern looks like. Now just keep a look at this sort of area to the north of Australia, and we'll have a look at what a wetter pattern looks like, say if we look at the spring of 2010. So there you go, a bit of a difference there. You can see all of this really warm water pushed up around Australia, heaps of cloud and moisture feeding into weather patterns. So that's a typical pattern of really wet years. Big La Nina in the Pacific, cool water here, trade winds stronger, blowing lots of moisture, all this warm water here. And the same the Indian Ocean, all the warm water's over on our side. So seasonal forecasting is really about trying to watch and where is all of this moisture and cloud activity going to be from one year to the next. Just looking at that 2010 sea surface temperature pattern, you can see really warm water there. Here's the cloud anomaly pattern. So these colours here are where there's less cloud than normal, and this is where there's more cloud. So you can see that this warmer water up here, you can see that that's reflected by a lot of extra cloud coming out of this area, and that just means there's a lot more chance of that feeding into our rain events in those years. When we look at a drier pattern, such as the 2006 spring pattern, you look here and you can see that there's more cloud. That cloud pattern's been shifted out into the Pacific, and it's been shifted out into the western Indian Ocean, but a lot less cloud to our north, and that really doesn't bode well usually for our weather patterns. And just looking at last year, you can see we had pretty good warm sea surface temperatures to the north, and see all of that extra cloud, and it was really the Indian Ocean dipole was really firing up, sending plenty of moisture our way. Now, when we look at the historical effect of the Pacific Ocean on rainfall at Cobden, what we've done here, this is where in El Nino years when there's less moisture coming from the Pacific, this is the part of Australia, Eastern Australia tends to be drier. When we go back through the long-term Cobden record and we look at the August to November rainfalls, because this is sort of the greatest correlations in our springs, we look at the 31 El Nino years in that long-term record at Cobden, and we get not just a third of those years that were dry, decile 1 to 3, but actually over half of them were dry. Really reduces the chance of having a wetter year, which is decile 8, 9, 10. When we look at the La Nina years, when there's extra moisture floating around in Eastern Australia, you can see it increases the chance of wetter or average, but there's still the chance of having a dry year. So El Nino and La Nina doesn't guarantee drier or wetter, but it certainly does, double the chance. And for that Cobden record, when we look at the Indian Ocean dipole, when it's in a dry phase, you can see there again, rather than a third of those years being dry, more than half of them were, and reduced chance of wetter. And when it's in its wet phase, like it was last year, quite a strong driver for southwest Victoria's rainfall, and more than half of those years were decile 8 to 10, and really reduced chance of dry. So important to keep an eye on both of those climate drivers. And even just looking at somewhere like Warnnambool, if we look at the long-term record, you can see again the El Nino fingerprints, increased chance there for drier whenever it's been an El Nino at Warnnambool. The same with the IOD when it's in its dry phase. Wetter at La Nina years makes it wetter at Warnnambool, and in IOD years when it's in its wet phase, it's only ever been average or wet. Now, looking at forecasting, there's a range of seasonal forecast models. We've got the Australian Bureau has seasonal forecasts for the next 3 and 6 months. There's also the European model. There's the ERI US models. We've also got UK models. There's a whole bunch of them all forecasting, and one of the things that our department does is puts them all together in a table. So Dale Gray does this, and this is for anyone who gets the fast break. Just drop an email to that.break@ecodev.vic.gov.au. These come out every month. Dale goes through them, and basically these tables look at each of the model. That's a European, that's the Australian Bureau, that's a Japanese one. There's 2 American ones there. Looks at their 3 month forecast and what they're thinking about the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, but then about looking at Victoria, saying, well, what colour have they got for it? Are they thinking wetter or drier? So you can just see with the current outlook for July, August, September, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's a number of them there that have got a dry signal there. So usually when more than half of these models are showing either a wetter or a drier pattern showing the same thing, it's worth taking note of. So that probably is just suggesting there's definitely increased chance of a drier outlook in the next couple of months. Also, those models, Dale looks at them for that longer term, the 4 to 6 months, and even in the 4 to 6 months, looking at Victoria, there's still a few of them there continuing on some of that dry pattern. So certainly this year we're in a different position to where we were at the same time last year, where most of these models had a slightly wetter signal. And that's the current sea surface temperature pattern at the moment. The El Nino that they thought was going to pop up really hasn't. But one of the things we're probably just keeping an eye on over the next month or two is if any of this cooler water hangs around here, it just reduces. If there's less cloud in this particular area, then it's not usually helpful for rain in our part of the world, especially in late winter, spring. And just looking at the last 30 days, one of the particular features of June has been a really strong pressure pattern. This sort of red is stronger pressure pattern, and we happen to be in the part of the world that's getting that. This time last year we had this sort of a colour here. We had a low pressure sitting over us. So there's a bit of a phase shift really that's currently underway. Now what I've talked about there is just for seasonal forecasting and good old-fashioned variability. What a lot of farmers ask, is there anything different going on now compared to long-term variability? And I guess one thing that is a bit different is this is just looking at long-term temperatures for Victoria going back to 1910 for the last 105 years. That's the summer temperatures, that's autumn maximum temperatures, winter and spring. So you can see a lot of variability from year to year there, but largely the last decade or so has been a fair bit warmer. Now milder winters tends to be probably good in southwest Victoria for better pasture growth. But one of the things that's been a bit bumpy for us is you can see in the last 10 years, you can see last spring was actually fairly close to average, but over the last 10 years most of them have been between 1 and even 3 degrees warmer than average, and so that's really summer turning up a bit earlier. And so when we get clear skies or a drier month, that earlier temperature can really bring in spring a bit quicker, and so that's one of the issues. It's part of the bumpy springs these days. That's just the local temps there, spring maximum temps from the Cape Otway Lighthouse, so you can just see that signal there. The other thing that's perhaps a bit different from long-term variability is that when we look at pressure, this is back to 1950 for this area of southern Australia. Pressure goes up and down the pressure pattern, and usually when we have El Ninos there's higher pressure over our part of the world, but you can sort of see there that as things become a bit warmer, the pressure pattern has been getting a bit stronger, and this is what's sort of expected to continue in future climate models when they look at climate change. So we're already sort of seeing those first stages of basically a bit of a higher pressure over our part of the world. So it just means that every now and then we'll have a few extra rain events that are squeezed to the south. And some recent analysis by David Stevens was just sort of looked at the seasonality of our rainfall and when it falls, and looked at the rainfall since the year 2000, comparing that to the previous 100 years. And what sort of found is that a lot of the sort of rainfall seasonality, the seasons had shifted south. So, from summer dominant and summer and uniform rainfall throughout the year, those sort of zones were shifting south, and that's largely as we'd expect to continue in coming decades. So there's lots of productive agriculture happening all over Australia, but it just probably does mean that in terms of the weather patterns for southwest, that we'll be looking at perhaps bigger summers and dealing with continued variability amongst all of that. And I guess while the climate might throw us a few challenges every now and then, these are all the things that are in our favour these days with modern technologies, R&D, genetics, innovations. We've got lots of things which help us deal better with variability. Lots of great infrastructure that's been put on farms and also in regions for storage of water, fodder, communications. All of these things help us. Growth in local and export markets has been really important. Business management to handle variable years in income. Don't need to tell anyone in dairy about the importance of that because it's not just markets, it's also the seasons and how they can really give us some bumpy signs. So this business management one's really critical. Farm plans and really looking after soils and pasture covers are really critical because often we do a lot of the risk is the damage that happens from when we're going through the drought, really dry years or really wet years. So how we manage those years depends on how well we look after soils longer term. And the key thing is just about making sure we've got good networks and knowledge and good contacts that confidence to grow. There's a bright future for agriculture, but it's really important that people are got hold of the steering wheel and making decisions so that it's all worthwhile for them. Okay, now I'll just share a few links. One of the things we've been looking at is deep soil moisture, measuring soil moisture. So it's not just about what's happening with seasonal forecasts, but one key thing is how much rain's already in the tank, and that's soil probe networks that are measuring soil moisture in the top 1 metre. And these can be useful just sometimes looking to see if we've got a full profile. This is showing some soil moisture for some probes, showing that that's when the soil profile is full and how quickly it's draining out. And sometimes we can get rain and it all looks good on top, but actually we've still only got half a profile of moisture. So that can be one thing, especially when it comes to trying to get an idea of how long spring's going to last. And these soil moisture probes, here's one example where there's soil moisture measured at 10 centimetre intervals, so you can tell with different rainfall events just how far it's got down the profile. And probably the riskier years is when everything's green on top, but you can see moisture hasn't got down to the 50 centimetre mark. This is another site here that the Bureau's just recently created. It basically looks at soil moisture, and you can just look at that. It's the current one showing where there's moisture in southwest is probably a bit above average compared to long-term normal for this time of the year, and certainly we're doing better than say parts of Gippsland for this time of the year. Here's some other sites that some farmers like using. This is the chart viewer, the Bureau site, where you can just hit play and it runs through the next 7 days weather chart. There's the 4 and 7 day rainfall outlook on the BOM water and land site. It's a good site. There's also BOM Med-Eye, which is a pretty useful site for wind, rainfall. I've mentioned the Climate app. There's a few other forecasts here sites that farmers use. There's the YRKnow, which gives a 10-day outlook. It's a European model though. One of the good things is the Bureau will be coming up with some multi-week forecasts hopefully in the next 12 months. Also, probably for seasonal outlooks, we'd suggest the Break newsletter from Victoria, so just drop an email to the Break and we can email that. There's also Milking the Weather, so just get in touch with us if you want to get that. That's really the Break, but in version suitable for dairy farmers. There's also the BOM's got their seasonal outlooks which come up, and these are updated monthly, but actually as of about October this year, hopefully they'll be updated fortnightly. So anyway, I hope that's been of use. Any queries, please drop us an email. If any of your farm groups would like to get some local interpretation, we can soon put together some recorded slideshows just like this for your part of the world. All the best.